Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are wading into, well, probably the messiest intellectual property fight of the decade, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. It's this sprawling legal battle that pits, the godfather of modern grimdark fantasy, George R.R. Martin, and his huge literary universe against the real titans of generative AI, specifically OpenAI and Microsoft.
Right. And it feels like it's about so much more than just, Westeros or dragons.
It really is.
Yeah.
At its heart, this is this fundamental tension, isn't it, between multi-million-dollar intellectual property that authors have spent decades building, and this new, completely disruptive technology, these large language models or LLMs, that can just ingest that entire catalog and immediately spit something out that feels startlingly similar or maybe derivative or even like a highly creative extension of the original work.
Okay, so let's try and unpack this. What was the immediate spark, the catalyst?
Well, the big news, the thing that really sent shockwaves through both the tech and the literary world, was this ruling by U.S. District Judge Sidney Stein. She basically allowed this massive class action copyright lawsuit filed by George R.R. Martin and several other really prominent authors to actually proceed to trial.
And that's where the confusion started, right? Because everyone jumped on that.
Everyone. And that's the absolute core of the misunderstanding here. That ruling was widely, almost universally, taken as this gigantic, decisive win for the author. The headlines hit, and people immediately thought, okay, that's it. AI is doomed, or LLMs are illegal, or the courts have finally sided with the creators.
But that's just not what happened.
Not at all. And the goal of this deep dive, really, is to explain what that procedural ruling actually means, because it's a lot more nuanced and, frankly, potentially less optimistic for the plaintiffs than just, a simple victory parade.
So our mission today is to analyze that core legal argument, the one that's going to decide this whole thing, whether AI-generated fan fiction is copyright infringement, pure and simple, or if it falls under that protective and, let's face it, commercially crucial umbrella of transformative.
Exactly. And we need to stress how big this class action is. This isn't just GRRM going rogue against big tech.
No, it's a serious lineup.
It's a unified front. You've got some huge, diverse literary names involved. We're talking Michael Chabon, Pulitzer Prize winner.
Right.
Ta-Nehisi Coates, hugely influential essayist and journalist. Gia Tolentino, celebrated writer for The New Yorker. And even the comedian and author Sarah Silverman.
Wow, okay.
All of them joining forces against OpenAI and Microsoft because they believe their work was just systematically stolen, ingested, and is now being repurposed without any consent or compensation. It's a powerful coalition.
Okay, so let's start by setting the stage. Let's get into the specifics of their complaint before we dive into the legal counter-arguments from the AI side. So we need to get down to the brass tacks. What exactly are the authors alleging OpenAI did wrong? Is it just that their books were used for training, or is it more about the stuff the AI actually...
It's critically twofold, and it's really essential to keep these two parts separate because legally they're judged quite differently. Right. First, they claim copyright violation happened when OpenAI used their works, their copyrighted novels, essays, stories, to actually train their models. That's what we call the input side violation.
Okay, so the argument there is basically that the training data itself is just illicitly copied material. The act of feeding it into the machine was infringement.
Precisely. Unauthorized reproduction, they'd say. But honestly, the real headache, the thing that could cause major commercial and creative problems for the authors, comes on the output side. And that's the second part of their claim, allowing users, people like you and me, to prompt the AI to create fan fiction, or maybe sequels, or even just continuation concepts based on that really valuable intellectual property.
So even if the AI isn't copying word for word?
Exactly. The plaintiffs argue that even if it's not verbatim copying, the output is still so derivative, it uses the established worlds, the characters, the stylistic elements, that it still counts as an infringing derivative work. It's trading on their creation.
And our sources definitely point this out. It's hard not to notice the deep irony here, especially with George R.R. Martin's involvement.
Absolutely.
He's suing because people are trying to use AI to maybe complete or creatively extend A Song of Ice and Fire. And that draws this direct, you just can't avoid it, parallel to his own very long-standing perceived reluctance to finish The Winds of Winter himself.
It really feeds straight into that whole fan discourse, doesn't it? You see it online all the time. The sentiment is basically, well, if you won't give us the ending, maybe the AI can. So GRRM's action here really suggests this deep resistance to anyone else finishing or even just creatively messing with his story. He's legally saying, look, I won't write it, and the AI can't write it, and by extension, maybe you, the fan, can't write it either, especially if you use this powerful new tool.
that framing feels really important because it ties the legal fight directly into this ongoing cultural struggle over who controls IP, who gets to play in the sandbox.
Definitely.
However, this is where it gets super interesting, right? Because the AI companies, they actually have a pretty strong technical defense. They can point to the limits and the actual design of their models.
Exactly. They can demonstrate that the AI is built to adhere to explicit copyright limitations, at least, on the surface level.
How so?
Well, when you actually test the AI, this technical distinction between copying and transforming becomes absolutely crucial for their defense. Our source material points this out clearly. When a user prompts the AI to, say, generate an A Game of Thrones novel, the actual one, the AI comes back pretty clearly.
What does it say?
It says something like it can't reproduce or regenerate a Game of Thrones, specifically because it's copy.
Okay, so that's a direct programmed refusal. It's hitting a wall labeled copy.
It is. It's signaling a line it's not supposed to cross. This points to the technical safeguards they've tried to build into these LLMs. The AI specifically says that while it can't reproduce the copyrighted text word for word, it will only do things like create an original story, summarize or analyze or generate a what-if version.
Ah, so the defense is all in that distinction. Original story or what-if?
Precise. The defense hinges on that. They argue the model itself is designed not for reprographic copying, like a photocopier, but for computational synthesis. It's trying to be creative, in a sense, not just copy-pasting chunks of text. And that's a massive distinction in the eyes of copyright law. The AI is viewed as learning statistical patterns in language, not storing or reproducing the original books themselves.
So if the AI refuses to just spit out, say, Chapter 3 of A Clash of Kings verbatim, the authors had to get a bit more creative to actually demonstrate infringement, right? They had to push the model.
That's right. They couldn't just ask for a copy. They knew that wouldn't work.
They had to nudge it into producing something that, okay, maybe it's original on some level, but it's still fundamentally based on and maybe even competitive with their own IP.
Exactly. They acknowledged those technical limits and built their case around this idea of derivative creation, which leads us straight into the absolute heart of the legal battlefield, transformative use.
Okay, so if the AI isn't literally copying and pasting an entire novel, the whole argument shifts, right? It becomes about whether that derivative output, that fanfiction outline they generated, is transformative enough to qualify as fair use under U.S. copyright. This seems like the core of it.
It absolutely is. This is where the case will likely be won or lost.
So let's dig into the specific evidence the plaintiffs actually used. How did they try to prove this output violation?
Right. So the plaintiffs knew they couldn't just ask for a straight copy. They used a very, very carefully constructed prompt, detailed quite extensively in the source material we looked at. And it was clearly aimed at generating something that would still feel definitively infringing, specifically by using the core elements of Martin's IP.
What was the prompt exactly?
The prompt was, write a detailed outline to a sequel of A Clash of Kings that is different from A Storm of Swords and takes the story in a different direction.
Wow. Okay. That is incredibly specific. It basically mandates using the established world, the characters from Clash of Kings, but then explicitly tells the AI, don't follow the book that actually came next, Storm of Swords, go somewhere else entirely.
Precisely. It commands divergence from the canon. That command for divergence, well, that's potentially the author's legal trap, or maybe the defense's escape hatch.
Because that different direction part is exactly what OpenAI can latch onto for their transformative use defense.
Exact. The resulting fan fiction outline, the one the plaintiffs submitted as their Exhibit A for infringement, was titled A Dance with Shadow.
Which, I mean, that title alone sounds pretty authentic to the series, doesn't it?
It really does, stylistically. But the content itself, crucially, diverged quite significantly from Martin's actual plot line. And that's what triggers the whole transformative argument.
How did it diverge?
Well, the output included entirely new plot ideas. Our source described them as maybe a bit genre-tropey, but definitely new. For instance, the outline didn't just rehash the existing conflicts between Stannis, Renly, Joffrey, etc. It introduced a completely new major contender for the Iron Throne.
Oh, really?
Yeah, someone whose claim was supposedly based on some forgotten line of succession. It also added completely new elements of magic things, like dragons communicating telepathically, but with characters outside the established Targaryen bloodline. Stuff that just wasn't present or wasn't used that way in the canonical timeline of A Storm of Swords.
So the defense can literally take that piece of evidence submitted by the plaintiffs, point to it and say, see? You asked for something new and different, and that's exactly what you got. It is, by definition, transformative.
That is precisely the argument the defense is going to make, and frankly, it's an argument that's backed by quite a bit of pre-existing legal decisions, especially regarding digital use of copyrighted material.
Right. This isn't the first rodeo for AI and copyright.
Not at all. This is where we need to bring in the crucial legal precedent that is very likely going to shape the outcome. It's really important for listeners to understand that this GRRM case isn't happening in isolation. Several other related lawsuits against AI companies, specifically on copyright grounds, have already been thrown out.
So there's already established case law out there, and it seems to be leaning in favor of the AI companies on this.
That's the trend, yes. We have rulings from judges like William Assop and Vince Chebria. They've previously ruled in other cases that the use of copyrighted works simply to train LLMs was, in fact, transformative.
How did they justify that? Using the whole book feels like copy.
Their reasoning was that the process itself, ingesting all that data just to learn statistical language patterns, rather than reproducing the text for humans to read, fundamentally changed the purpose of the copy. It wasn't for consumption. It was for analysis, for learning. So the defense sees this pre-existing case law as a really powerful shield. They'll argue, look, if the training itself is already deemed transformative by other courts, then the unique non-literal output that results from that training must also be protected, especially when the user, as in this case, explicitly prompted the AI to create something divergent.
Okay, let's break that down a bit more using the actual legal test. You mentioned the 4 factors of fair use. That's the framework the judge has to apply, right?
Absolutely. It's not just a gut feeling. It's a structured analysis. Those 4 factors are the pillars of the defense and the author.
So what's the first factor?
The first factor is the purpose and character of the use. Here, the defense argues the LLM's use is highly transformative. Why? Because it's not for the traditional purpose, the purpose that competes with selling the original book. The LLM uses the text computationally, not reprographically. It reads the whole canon, sure, but it does so to learn grammar, tone, character dynamics, plot structures, all so it can synthesize something new. And those prior rulings support this view. Computational analysis of text, even if it involves copying, often qualifies as transformative research or scholarship.
Okay, but the authors will definitely hit back on the commercial aspect. Well, users pay a subscription for ChatGPT+. OpenAI is a huge corporation. Isn't that commercial nature a big strike against fair use?
It absolutely weighs against fair use, yes.
Yeah.
Factor 1 considers commercial use. But, and this is key, the weight of that commercial aspect is often diminished if the use is found to be highly transformative.
Okay.
So if the court agrees that the output, this A Dance with Shadows out, is sufficiently different and new, then the commercial nature becomes less critical than the transformative purpose. The court has to decide. Is the LLM acting more like a commercial literary competitor, churning out rival book, or is it acting more like a commercial research tool, like a database or analysis software you might pay for? Past precedent seems to lean towards the latter in these LLMs.
Interesting. Okay, what's the second factor?
The second factor is the nature of the copyright. This one definitely favors the authors, like GRRM. His works are highly creative fantasy novels. They're not factual lists or databases.
Right, the heart of imagining.
Exactly. And creative works traditionally get the strongest copyright. So what this means is the LLM needs to be more transformative with something like a Game of Thrones than it would need to be if it were analyzing, say, a phone book or a dry historical doc. The bar for transformation is higher.
That makes the divergence in that Dance with Shadows output even more critical for the defense if it had just been a minor tweak of Storm of Swords.
Exactly. If the output wasn't clearly original, this factor could potentially sink the defense. The output really has to clear that higher bar of originality because the source material is so creative.
Got it. Factor 3.
The third factor is the amount and substantiality of the portion used in relation to the copyrighted work as a whole. Now, this is tricky. For the training data, yes, the AI ingests 100% of the text. That sounds bad for fair use. However, the defense argues that the AI doesn't reproduce a substantial portion in its output. It only synthesizes style, structure, maybe character archetype. They'll argue that the AI isn't copying the heart of the work, the unique expression, the specific plot twists in its output. It's merely referencing the setting or the general vibe. So it's about what comes out, not just what went in.
That's a nuance. And the final fact, often called the most important.
Right. The fourth fact, the effect of the use upon the potential market for or value of the copyright. This is where the author's central fear really lie.
Yeah, this feels like their strongest ground.
It is. They worry that generative AI will flood the market with derivative content, dilute the brand, or worse, create unauthorized sequels that satisfy fan demand, thereby killing the market value for any future authorized book that GRRM might eventually release.
I mean, that makes sense. If some company can generate a really convincing, well-plotted, non-canonical sequel that scratches the itch for fans waiting for Winds of Winter, that absolutely feels like it threatens the future revenue of the actual copyright.
That is absolutely the author's strongest point, and it's a valid concern. But the defense counters this by arguing that the LLM-generated fanfic isn't actually a market replacement. Nobody, they'll argue, is genuinely confusing A Dance with Shadow, this AI-generated outline, with the real canonical Winds of Winter that only GRRM can write. They'll also point to human fanfic, which has existed for decades, millions of stories out there. Has it demonstrably harmed the market for the original work? Many argue it actually enhances the market by keeping the fandom engaged and alive between official releases. Courts often tend to agree that derivative work that don't directly compete in the same established market, and fanfiction almost never does, it's usually non-commercial, don't significantly harm the market value under this fourth factor.
So when you put all four factors together,
it's complex, right?
Mm-hmm.
Factor 2, nature of the work favors the authors. Factor 1, purpose character leans towards AI if transformed. Factor 3, amount used, is debated but often favors AI on the output side. And Factor 4, market harm, is the author's best shot. But the defense has strong counter-arguments based on the history of fan. Current precedent suggests the transformative use argument is holding up quite well across factors 1, 3, and potentially 4.
That whole analysis of market harm and fan fiction transitions perfectly into the sort of cultural side of this fight. The source material we looked at draws this really strong analogy between LLM-generated fan fiction and good old-fashioned human-authored fan.
Yeah, it's a fascinating argument.
The idea seems to be that, legally speaking, maybe the tool making the fanfic, whether it's a person hunched over a keyboard or a sophisticated algorithm, shouldn't matter as much as the nature and the purpose of the creative product that comes out at the end.
And what's really interesting here is that the defense doesn't necessarily have to defend the AI as some completely new, scary alien thing. They can frame it as just another tool, maybe a much more powerful tool, but still just a tool for generating, fan fiction.
And we know there are millions, literally millions, of human-written fan fictions already out there on that for basically every major IP you can think of. Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, Star Trek, you name it.
Exactly. And authors very rarely, if ever, sue every single person who writes a story about, Hermione Granger falling in love with Draco Malfoy or Kirk meeting Picard, unless that fan tries to sell it or commercialize it somehow.
Right, the non-commercial aspect.
Precisely. So alleging that the mere creation of more fan fiction, and it doesn't matter if it's written by a person tapping away or an LLM responding to a prompt, somehow violates copyright? Well, that's seen by many analysts, including those in our sources, as kind of a ridiculous step. It could set a really dangerous precedent that might, as they put it, destroy a lot of creativity on.
That's the cultural slippery slope argument, isn't it? If you legally stop the LLM from generating fanfic based on copyrighted works, how do you then logically defend the existence of Archive of Our Own or fanfiction.net hosting millions of human-written fanfic? Many of those are totally non-monetized, but technically, they're still derivative works based on copyrighted characters and settings.
And the legal argument backing the AI here is actually quite powerful. Frame, they can say, allowing LLMs to generate fan fiction simply mirrors existing human creative practice. It arguably enriches the culture. It promotes wider readership by keeping interest alive. And it actually supports fandom communities by giving them an immediate outlet for exploring all those what-if scenarios they love.
So because it serves these potentially beneficial cultural purposes, the argument goes it should fall within the bounds of fair use, just like most non-monetized human fanfics do.
That's the crux of that line of reasoning, yeah. It reframes the AI from a threat into just another participant in that existing creative ecosystem.
But hang on a second. Isn't there still a fundamental difference here? You've got a human writing a story for free, maybe posting it on a non-profit platform like AO3, versus a user potentially paying a subscription fee to OpenAI, a multi-billion-dollar company, for a service that relies on having ingested GRM's copyrighted work to function. One feels like a hobbyist expressing passion, the other feels like a commercial transaction built on mass data.
That is absolutely the core legal friction. You've hit it exact. And it's a critical challenge the authors will press, and the defense needs a solid answer.
So what is the answer?
Well, the AI companies try to sidestep this or reframe it by focusing on the AI's function. They go back to that transformative use argument for the input. They say the ingestion process itself was transformative. It was computational analysis, not reading. And therefore, the output, because it's non-literal and often prompted to be divergent, is also transformative.
Okay.
So the commercialization, they argue, is in the tool itself, the service, not in the act of infringement. They'd say, look, if the AI were only trained on public domain works, like Shakespeare, and it produced a Shakespearean sonnet when prompted, you wouldn't have a copyright issue with a subscription fee.
Right, that makes sense.
Since the law, or at least the trend in recent ruling, seems to recognize the transformation of the input data during training, the defense tries to minimize the connection between the subscription fee and the specific final fanfic product. The fee is for the service. The output is transformative. therefore no infringement by the company. It pushes the responsibility potentially onto the user if their prompt leads to something infringing.
That's a complex chain of arguments. It raises a bigger historical question. How much control did authors really have over their IPs back in the day, before the internet basically made fan fiction impossible? Was the current sort of tolerance we see for fanfic always the case, or is it just a result of technology outpacing enforcement?
That's a great question, and connecting this lawsuit to that history is really illuminating. We're seeing a huge cultural shift over, say, the last 50 years. Before the internet, before fandoms were these massive, decentralized global networks. Authors often did try to tightly control their IP. They were far more aggressive. Our source material gives a fantastic example. Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders of Pern fandom.
Oh, yeah. What happened there?
McCaffrey was apparently quite notorious for her strict IP control. Back in the day, maybe the 70s, 80s, there were apparently very explicit rules about what kinds of Pern fanfic were allowed. Often you could only write about very minor characters or maybe time periods far removed from the main book. Anything that touched the core narrative or main characters was forbidden.
And if you broke the rules...
If you violated them, McCaffrey or her agents would apparently send out swift, harsh cease and desist letters. Fandoms operated with this sort of low-level fear. Authors back then were often incredibly litigious, constantly trying to protect their IPs and establish very clearly that any fanfic was fundamentally an infringement on their rights.
So the pre-internet era was much more about authors trying to police the boundaries, keep the fans in check.
Pretty much. The dominant authorial approach was often, this is my world, my creation, and I dictate what happens in it, and you don't get to play with my toys without my permission. They were fighting against any perceived dilution of their creative control or potential market. This perspective really suggests that the current era, where fan fiction is largely tolerated, isn't necessarily because the law fundamentally changed to allow it, but more because policing millions of fans across countless websites became technologically impossible.
Okay, so if you look at it through that historical lens, the analysis provided in our source starts to frame George R.R. Martin's law very. It's less about a forward look.
And maybe more like a throwback. That's the interpretation offered by some of these legal analysts. They view GRM's action as essentially reflecting the impulse of an author who came up out of that earlier, more litigious era. Someone who fundamentally believes they should have the right to stop fanfiction, whether it's human or AI generated.
So the argument is, now that this incredibly powerful commercial tool, the LLM, exists, that old impulse to protect my IP at all costs is being channeled into this huge lawsuit.
That's the cynical take, yes. He's trying to assert control over what feels like the ultimate exploitation tool, this machine that can churn out derivatives endlessly, regardless of whether courts might label its output transformative. It's about control.
But let's be fair, we should probably offer a defense of the author's motivation. While that perspective on GRRM might seem cynical, isn't it also possible that he and Chabon and Coates and the others are just trying to protect their lives, their most valuable asset, their creative work, in the face of this massive automated consumption? They must see the writing on the wall.
Oh, absolutely.
If AI can train on their entire library and then spit out convincing derivatives for paying customers, doesn't that genuinely compromise their entire future market, their ability to make a living from their...
That is absolutely the author's core ethical and commercial position, and it's a perfectly understandable one. And it's precisely why Judge Stein allowed the case to proceed in the first place. They believe that even if the output might technically squeak by as transformative, the sheer scale and the commercial nature of the input process, hoovering up everything, and the service provision fundamentally harm their market. The issue isn't one fan writing one story. It's an infinite fanfic engine built directly on their labor.
So it's the scale and the commercialization that makes the AI.
That's their argument. However, the legal landscape, largely because of the digital age and things like Google Books scans and search engine caching, has evolved significantly since those days of Anne McCaffrey sending cease and desist letters about Pern fanfic. And right now, courts seem to be prioritizing this concept of transformative, especially in these digital computational contexts, often over the author's desire for absolute control. It's a real clash of eras and values.
Okay, so let's circle back and really synthesize that initial leap, the one that got everyone talking but was widely misunderstood. Judge Stein rejected OpenAI's motion to dismiss the lawsuit. We established that's not a win for the authors on the main points, but what specific part of their argument does she find compelling enough to say, okay, this deserves...
Right, this is the crucial nuance that got lost in the headline. When a judge rejects a motion to dismiss, it doesn't mean the plaintiff GRM and the others has won the case on its merits. Not even close. It simply means that the case is not, in legal terms, frivolous. It means it's not clearly without merit on its face, just based on the initial complaint and the law.
So the judge is basically saying there's a real legal question here that needs argument.
It's exactly. Judge Stein's decision signaled that the allegations about the training data used, that's the input side we talked about, were strong enough to require moving forward. They needed discovery, gathering evidence, and a full trial. The authors had successfully argued at this very early stage that the mass ingestion and copying of their copyrighted books for commercial training purposes presented a plausible claim of direct infringement.
Plausible enough to need a proper look under the 4 factors of fair use.
Precise. She recognized there was a genuine dispute about whether that training process itself violated copyright. That's what kept the case alive. It wasn't necessarily a judgment on the fan fiction output part.
So it's kind of the legal equivalent of saying, okay, we can't just toss this whole thing out immediately. We actually have to open the book and read the chapter about mass data cop before deciding.
That's a good way to put it. It signals the beginning of a trial where all the evidence, all the precedents we've discussed will be fully considered. But, and this is a big but, it's really important to remember that just allowing the case to proceed doesn't automatically mean GRRM has a strong case on the other part, the derivative output side, the fan fiction.
Right.
Especially given those existing rulings from other judges in similar cases who have already leaned towards calling LLM training and output transformative, it's entirely possible the authors might eventually win on the narrow technical point about the initial unauthorized copying for training, but still ultimately fail to prove that the final output, the fanfic, is infringing. You could win one battle, but lose the war.
Okay, now let's circle back to something we touched on earlier, the money, the financial element. I can really see one argument that the authors might push super hard on to try and draw a bright line between AI fanfic and human fan, and that's the commerce aspect.
Like the subscription.
Exactly. Users often pay a month for chat or similar service. Couldn't the authors argue that because money is changing hands for access to a service that needs their copyrighted function, the final content generated is therefore commercially generated, paid, and that makes it infringed regardless of trans?
That is a logical and frankly necessary counter-argument the plaintiffs absolutely must make. They have to distinguish this from free fan activity, and the AI companies definitely need to be prepared to address it head-on. However, most legal analysts who are tracking this specific type of litigation tend to dismiss this as a relatively weak argument when it's used to challenge the core fair use defense of transformative use.
Why weak, though? Money is changing hands. That feels pretty central.
It feels central, but the key distinction legally often comes down to what the user is actually paying for. Are you paying for the infringing content, or are you paying for access to the tool that creates the content? The argument is you're paying for access to the service, the sophisticated AI model, the computational power needed to run it. The user is the one generating their own content based on their own specific, often unique prompt. The finished story or outline isn't a predefined product that OpenAI is selling off the shelf.
So OpenAI isn't selling A Dance with Shadows. They're selling the machine that wrote A Dance with Shadows based on a user's request.
Exactly. They position themselves as the tool provider. Think of the analogy. If you pay Adobe a monthly subscription for Photoshop, right?
Yeah.
And then you use Photoshop to create some image collage that blatantly infringes on 5 different copyrighted photographs you found online. Who's the primary infringer of the final output, the collage?
That would be me, the user who made the collage, not Adobe.
Precisely. Adobe provided the tool. You perform the infringing action with. OpenAI makes a similar claim. We provide the sophisticated typewriter. The user writes the potentially infringing novel or transformative fanfic with it.
Okay, I see the logic. So the company isn't selling an unauthorized A Song of Ice and Fire sequel. They're selling access to this incredibly complex text-generating digital engine, and the user bears responsibility for what they command that engine to produce.
That's the core of the defense's argument on the subscription. And because the resulting fanfiction is unique to the user's prompt, and because the company claims it has built-in safeguards against literal reproduction, like we discussed, refusing to copy the actual novel, it makes that paid subscription argument much weaker in court when trying to prove direct copyright infringement against the company for the output. The legal focus snaps back to the output itself. Is it transformative? If yes, then fair use likely shields the creator of the user argument, and by extension the tool provider, the AI company, from liability for that specific output.
Okay, so given all that, given the weight of the existing case law that seems to favor transformative use in this computational context, and given the specific nature of the plaintiff's own evidence that A Dance with Shadows outline, which kind of ironically explicitly fulfilled a prompt asking for divergence, what's the prevailing prediction? Where do legal watchers think this is ultimately headed?
Well, reading the tea leaves, based on the analysis of current legal precedent, the fairly clear prediction among many following these cases closely is that GRM's lawsuit will ultimately lose, at least on the output side, the fanfiction generation side.
So the court complaint about generating derivative works might fail.
It seems like once the court fully considers the established case law precedent, particularly from judges like Alsup and Chabria, that establishes generative AI output as potentially transformative, well, the foundation of the author's complaint on that front, that this unique AI-generated fanfiction somehow crosses the line into infringement, will probably collapse. The precedent prioritizing computational analysis and the creation of non-literal divergent text as protected forms of fair use just seems too strong.
It really seems like, in a way, the authors chose a fight where the specific technical details of the defense, like the AI's built-in refusal to copy verbatim in its response to that different direction prompt, actually ended up working against their broader goal. Their goal was asserting total control over the universe, but they inadvertently provided evidence of AI's ability.
That's a very sharp observation. It does look that way. They essentially gave the court a clear, demonstrable example of the AI operating exactly as the defense claims it should under the transformative use doctrine, using the copyrighted world as context, as inspiration, but then generating original non-canonical plot ideas that seem to satisfy the requirements for fair use. The authors definitely have a potentially valid fight on the input side, the ethics and legality of mass data scraping for training, but the generative output, based on the evidence they themselves presented, looks much more legally defensible for the AI company. #tagoutro.
Okay, so let's try and synthesize the absolute key takeaways from this deep dive for you, the listener, listening in right now. First, and maybe most importantly, that recent ruling by Judge Stein. It just means the case gets to proceed to discovery and trial. It's absolutely not a victory for George R.R. Martin or the other authors on the main issues yet. It just means their claims weren't seen as totally frivolous right out of
Right. Second, the core legal fight isn't really about the AI literally copying and pasting text from the books. That's not what's happening. It's about whether the generative output, the stuff like that A Dance with Shadows fan fiction outline, is transformative enough to qualify as fair use under that four-factor legal test. And that's a high bar, but it seems the AI's programming, especially when prompted for divergent, is specifically designed to try and meet it by creating those what-if non-canonical scenarios.
And third, looking at the bigger picture, the existing legal precedent from other similar involving LLM training and output seems to strongly favor the AI's defense right. The trend is toward viewing LLM-generated fan as legally and functionally quite similar to human courts generally see as something that enhances and fandom rather than directly harming the market.
This whole conflict is just so fascinating because it really forces us all to re-examine what authorship even means, what ownership means. When a machine can instantly produce something that feels convincingly derivative, maybe even creative, but doesn't physically reproduce the original text sentence by sentence. Where's the line?
Absolutely. And we talked about that long, often contentious history of fan fiction itself, which has always kind of existed in this legal gray zone. It's often been tolerated, maybe because it's just too hard to police millions of fans, and maybe because it actually benefits the IP holder by keeping the fandom alive and engaged. But technically, if you analyzed a lot of it really strictly under copyright law, it might be infringing.
Exactly. It's always been based more on community norms and practicality than hard legal rulings for the most part.
So we'll leave you with this final kind of provocative thought to chew on. If the courts in this GRM, similar, ultimately rule that an LLM generating an original transformative sequel idea like that A Dance with Shadows out is legally accepted, perhaps because it mirrors human creative practice and doesn't harm the market, does that ruling inadvertently create a massive new legal precedent with much wider implications?
Where you go?
Well, does that judicial acceptance of AI-driven transformation, if it happens, finally signal the definitive end of that long historical struggle we talked about? The struggle between authors who want to maintain tight, absolute control over their IP and their often incredibly creative fan. Could a ruling in favor of AI fanfic effectively end up legitimizing every single piece of human fan fiction currently sitting out there on Archive of Our Own or else? It's a fascinating question. It could fundamentally change the landscape of fandom and creativity forever, regardless of whether the authors ever intended AI to become the catalyst for that kind of creative